There is a particular quiet that falls over a room when a Gen X man is asked how he feels. It is not confusion. It is not defensiveness. It is something closer to a door closing without a sound. He looks at you steadily and he says, "Nothing is wrong." His jaw sets, his shoulders square, and the air around him thickens into something unspoken. You have seen this before in a father, a boss, a partner, a friend who simply stops mid-argument and disappears behind his own eyes. The silence does not read as anger. It reads as absence, as if the person in front of you has quietly left the conversation while his body stayed behind. I notice that this silence rarely announces itself as a decision. It arrives instead like weather, something that happens to him rather than something he chooses. He does not raise his voice, and he does not lower it either, because there is no voice being used at all. He simply stops. You watch the exchange go still, waiting for a reaction that never lands, and you begin to wonder whether the stillness is protecting something or hiding it. Either way, the silence has already answered a question you have not yet asked. The stillness spreads once you start looking for it. He goes quiet at the dinner table when a decision he made is questioned. He goes quiet in a meeting when a colleague challenges a plan he built alone. He goes quiet with a partner who raises her voice even slightly, retreating into a stillness that feels rehearsed rather than spontaneous. You start to notice that the silence appears in almost every domain where conflict could otherwise surface. It shows up with children, with parents, with spouses, with coworkers, in patterns too consistent to be incidental. The repetition itself becomes the clue, because a single silence could be circumstance, but a lifetime of silences starts to look like architecture. This is where individual psychology alone stops accounting for what is happening. A single man's temperament might explain one quiet evening, but it cannot explain a shared, dependable stillness across an entire generation of men raised in overlapping conditions. Something beyond personality is holding this pattern in place, something structural rather than personal, something that was built into him before he ever had the chance to choose otherwise. The consistency across so many separate lives points toward a shared inheritance rather than a private trait. That inheritance begins in an economy that trained emotional restraint as a survival skill. He came of age during recessions, layoffs, and a labor market that rewarded self-sufficiency over vulnerability, so asking for help read as a liability rather than a strength. The workplace he entered demanded composure under pressure, and composure quickly became indistinguishable from silence itself. Technology arrived late in his formative years, meaning his early relational habits were built entirely offline, in rooms where withdrawal was the only private space available. Emotional culture around him treated feelings as something to manage quietly rather than something to voice publicly, so expression itself began to look like weakness. Social responsibility fell onto him early, often as the reliable one, the fixer, the person who absorbed problems instead of naming them.
Each of these forces did not operate separately, but layered onto one another until restraint became indistinguishable from identity. By the time these conditions converge, it becomes clear that no single mechanism explains the silence completely. Economic precarity taught caution, emotional culture taught concealment, and early responsibility taught self-reliance, and none of these alone would produce such a durable pattern. It is the layering of several adaptations at once that gives the silence its unusual permanence. Recognizing this multiplicity changes what needs to be examined next, because a phenomenon this layered can only be understood one level at a time. What becomes visible now is not one psychological process, but several, stocked like sediment, each one shaping the ones above it. The pattern operates simultaneously as behavior, as habit, as identity, as duty, as relationship, as meaning, and as something larger than any one man carries alone. Naming these levels does nothing yet to explain them, only to mark where the deeper inquiry must travel. The behavior is where anyone would notice it first. The habit is where it becomes recognizable as a pattern rather than a moment. The identity is where it stops being something he does and starts being something he is. The duty is where the silence starts to feel like an obligation rather than a preference. The relationships are where the silence begins shaping other people, not just himself. The meaning is where he starts to justify the silence as a form of strength. And beneath all of it sits something collective, a blind spot shared by an entire generation rather than owned by any single man. The behavior is the entry point, so the inquiry begins there. He sits through an argument with his arms crossed, eyes fixed somewhere just past your shoulder, saying almost nothing while the conversation continues without him. You notice he answers in short phrases, if he answers at all, and that his stillness has a practiced quality to it. This is not the silence of someone thinking, but the silence of someone waiting for the moment to end. You recognize this because you have watched it happen with a father who left the room mid-disagreement or a partner who went quiet the instant emotion entered his voice. Something keeps this exact response returning across decades and across completely different relationships, which suggests it is doing something functional for him. Withdrawal lowers the temperature of an argument almost instantly because a silent man cannot be provoked into saying something he will regret. His nervous system may have learned, long before language could explain it, that stillness ends conflict faster than confrontation ever could. You start to see that his silence is not empty, but is quietly working to prevent an escalation he has learned to fear. A response like this can only continue if the environment keeps rewarding it, and this one clearly has. Every argument that ends the moment he goes quiet reinforces the idea that silence is what makes conflict stop. Over enough repetitions, this response stops feeling like a strategy and starts feeling like an automatic reflex, something that happens to him rather than something he activates on purpose. You notice that he no longer seems to weigh the decision to withdraw, because the withdrawal now arrives before any decision could be made. Once a response becomes automatic, something has to give way to make room for it. What disappears first is his access to his own reaction in real time, because a reflex bypasses the reflection that used to accompany it. He stops noticing what he actually feels during conflict, because noticing was never necessary for the reflex to fire. You start to sense that what looks like calm control is, underneath, a kind of quiet disconnection from his own internal state. This disconnection does not resolve itself, because losing access to a feeling does not make the need for that feeling disappear. Something has to hold the space where that awareness used to live, and that space becomes the next place to examine.
The habit that formed around this reflex is not the same as the reflex itself, and it operates on a slower, more permanent timescale. He has stopped noticing that he goes quiet because the pattern has become so routine that it no longer registers as a pattern at all. His partner points it out sometimes, describing an exact posture, an exact silence, an exact moment where he disappears, and he is genuinely surprised to hear it described so precisely. You notice this surprise is real, not defensive, as though the habit has become invisible to the very person performing it. This invisibility persists because habits that operate outside conscious awareness rarely trigger the reflection needed to interrupt them. If he does not see the pattern, he has no reason to question why it exists, and the pattern simply continues to run beneath his notice. You start to understand that habits like this are not maintained through effort, but through the absence of any signal telling him to look closer. For a habit to run this quietly for this long, it must be doing something the rest of his life depends on. Predictability is the reward here, because a habitual withdrawal means conflict always ends the same manageable way, without surprises that would demand new emotional skills he never built. His relationships have organized themselves around this predictability, adjusting their own behavior so his silence rarely gets challenged. You notice that people around him have learned the pattern too and have quietly stopped testing it. Once other people adjust to a habit this completely, the habit stops being just his and becomes shared infrastructure in the relationship. What disappears here is the possibility of surprise, of genuine unscripted emotional exchange, because the relationship has been engineered around avoiding exactly that. You start to notice a strange stillness in his closest relationships, a calm that feels less like peace and more like an agreement no one signed but everyone follows. This kind of quiet agreement cannot last without eventually shaping how he understands himself, because a pattern this old inevitably becomes part of his sense of who he is. The habit that once served a function now begins to calcify into something closer to a fixed part of his personality. He describes himself as someone who does not make a big deal out of things, someone who handles conflict calmly rather than emotionally. You notice he says this with a certain quiet pride, as if the silence itself has become evidence of his strength rather than a habit he fell into by circumstance. He is not performing composure here. He genuinely believes this stillness reflects who he fundamentally is. Identity like this consolidates because a trait repeated often enough eventually feels less like behavior and more like nature. If he has been quiet in conflict for 30 years, it becomes almost impossible for him to imagine himself any other way, since the alternative has never been rehearsed. You start to see that the silence has stopped being something he does under certain conditions and has become something he simply is, regardless of conditions. Once a trait becomes identity, questioning it feels less like adjusting a behavior and more like threatening a sense of self. Any suggestion that his silence might be limiting rather than strong lands as a personal accusation instead of useful feedback. You notice how quickly he defends the trait itself whenever someone questions its cost, as though the trait and his worth have become the same thing. A self-concept this fused with a single trait leaves very little room for what that trait might be costing elsewhere in his life. What disappears here is his own permission to be anything other than composed, because composure has become the entire architecture of who he believes himself to be. This narrowing of identity does not stay contained to himself alone, because a man who understands himself this way inevitably brings that understanding into every role he occupies. He becomes the one people call when something goes wrong, precisely because he can be counted on not to react. Family members route conflict through him, co-workers assign him the difficult conversations, and friends lean on his composure as a kind of emotional infrastructure. You notice that his steadiness has become a role rather than a personality trait, one that other people now depend on without realizing how much they are asking of him. This role persists because dependability like his is genuinely useful to the people around him, and usefulness is rarely questioned once it becomes reliable. Nobody asks whether the silence is costing him anything, because the silence is solving a problem for everyone else in the room. You start to notice that his value to others has quietly become tied to the very pattern that isolates him. Being needed in this specific way leaves little space for him to be anything other than steady, because stepping out of the role would disrupt something other people now depend on. What disappears here is his standing to ask for the same steadiness in return, since the role was built around him providing it rather than receiving it. A responsibility this one-directional inevitably reshapes the relationships closest to him, because no relationship stays balanced when one person is always the anchor. His closest relationships begin to organize themselves around his silence as though it were a fixed feature of the landscape. A partner learns not to push during disagreements. Children learn to read his mood from posture rather than words, and friends learn to fill conversational gaps he leaves behind.
You notice that the people around him have become fluent in a language he never spoke aloud, translating his stillness into meaning on his behalf. This translation continues because it works well enough to keep relationships functioning, even if it leaves something unspoken permanently unspoken. Each person around him adopts individually, without ever comparing notes, so the accommodation feels invisible even as it becomes structural. You start to see a whole ecosystem of interpretation built around a man who has never explained what any of it means. An ecosystem like this eventually asks something of everyone inside it, because interpreting silence requires effort that a shared vocabulary would have made unnecessary. What disappears here is the possibility of direct emotional exchange, replaced instead by inference, guesswork, and quiet accommodation. When relationships are built this heavily around interpretation, the man at the center inevitably starts to construct a story about what all of it means. He tells himself that his silence protects the people he loves from a version of him that might otherwise be harsh or overwhelming. You notice that this story is not entirely false, since restraint probably has spared people from reactions that would have landed harder. But you also notice the story conveniently keeps him from examining what the silence might be costing him personally, framing it purely as a gift to others. This meaning holds because it lets him experience the pattern as virtue rather than limitation, which requires less confrontation with himself than the alternative would. A story like this is comfortable precisely because it resolves the tension without requiring change, allowing the pattern to continue with his full endorsement. You start to notice that meaning-making like this often functions less as insight and more as permission to keep doing what he was already doing. Once meaning has been assigned this cleanly, it becomes very difficult to see the pattern from outside his own framing, because the framing itself was built to prevent exactly that kind of scrutiny. What disappears here is his curiosity about alternatives, since the current story already explains everything to his satisfaction. A story this personal, however, rarely stays personal, because too many men are telling themselves some version of the same one. I notice this as no longer only his story, because millions of men from the same generation describe an almost identical justification in almost identical language. You recognize the phrase before he finishes it, because you have heard other men explain their silence the exact same way, as protection rather than avoidance. This repetition across so many separate lives suggests something collective is operating beneath what feels, to each man individually, like a private choice. A blind spot this widespread persists precisely because it is shared, since no single man experiences it as unusual when everyone around him is doing something similar. Each man assumes his silence is his own adaptation, unaware that an entire generation adapted in nearly the same direction at nearly the same time. You start to sense that what looks like personal restraint is, at this scale, closer to a collective psychological pattern moving quietly through millions of individual lives. This collective quality is what makes the pattern so difficult to name from inside it, because a shared blind spot rarely announces itself as blind. There is no further layer beneath this one, only the recognition that the previous 6 were never separate from each other at all. Looking back across everything just observed, the behavior was never isolated from the habit that sustained it. The habit was never separate from the identity it eventually became, and the identity was never separate from the responsibility it created for others. The responsibility reshaped the relationships around him. The relationships generated the meaning he assigned to his own silence, and not meaning was never truly private, since an entire generation of men built something remarkably similar out of the same conditions. Each layer fed the others continuously rather than standing on its own, which is why pulling on any single layer alone was never going to explain the whole pattern. What remains after all of this is a simple observation rather than a conclusion. He is still just a psychological pattern visible in ordinary rooms, at ordinary dinner tables, during ordinary disagreements that never quite become conversations. You may recognize now that what once felt like a personal experience of a father, a partner, or a friend was never only personal at all. It was always a structure built quietly across decades, operating through a man who rarely chose it consciously and rarely noticed it operating. The investigation stops here, at the exact point where recognition settles in without resolving into advice or explanation of what to do next. There is another pattern nearby, one just as familiar and just as unnamed, sitting quietly behind the one just described. He has not been fully understood yet, not by you, not even by himself, and something in that incompleteness invites another look. You are welcome to keep watching, not to find an answer, but simply to keep noticing. Thank you for staying through this entire psychological investigation from beginning to end. I would be curious to know which layer felt the most familiar to you personally: the behavior, the habit, the identity, the responsibility, the relationships, the meaning, or the blind spot beneath all of them. If this kind of quiet, observational analysis is useful to you, staying subscribed with notifications on will keep these investigations arriving as they continue.